Good evening, and welcome to another edition of Community Issues, a Tapestry of Concerns. I'm your host, Alyce Smith Cooper, and I have the good pleasure this evening of being able to introduce to some, but present to most, one of the giants of our community, Dr. Carol Wayman. If you don't know about him, you need to know that Dr. Wayman is a graduate of Howard University. I don't know that he got both of his PhDs there or not, but he's got two of them. He is the president of the alumni for Howard University as we speak at this particular time. He developed and inaugurated the Black Studies Department at San Diego State University in 1970, where he taught for 8 years and directed teacher training programs for teachers in the inner city schools. He's a professor of psychology, sociology, and anthropology at Mesa College for 26 years. He was the first Black core faculty member of the California School of Professional Psychology here in San Diego for 4 years. Was co-owner and founder of the University of American Studies from 1992 to 1997. In the area of psychology, Dr. Wayman is a licensed and credentialed school psychologist, a licensed psychological examiner, a credentialed guidance counselor, and he has certificates in human sexuality and hypnosis training. In other words, he is a Renaissance man and a historian, and many, many more things. I'm not going to take up all the time telling you about him, but I do want you to bear with him this evening because he's here even under the circumstances of almost having lost his voice. But he was committed, as this shows the man's character. He was committed to being here this evening because there's some things that he wants you to know about what's going on right now here in San Diego. In other words, what you should know before we go. And that's the title of the San Diego Unified Social Revolution, as it's being called here. Am I right about that?
That's correct. Correct.
Where did that title come from? What you should know before we go?
Interesting. It came from our discussion, when I say our, many groups that I've known over the last 40 years, that so many of us were dying off, getting older, and with the death of some in the past 2 years, as you know, there's Walter Kaduma, a giant in the community. There's Cleo Malone, died, and then there was Chuck Adams, died. All of these giants that I work with were dying off, as well as some of the women, too. And we decided, wait a minute, this makes no kind of sense. All the people don't know what we want them to know yet.
Exactly.
So we decided that we would have, last November the 7th, we decided we better have some kind of reunion here before the rest of us die. And we decided to call it What You Should Know Before We Go.
What
San Diego
you should know before we go. That's
yeah.
right.
Yeah. And the unfinished social revolution in San Diego. And that's how that came about. And we met and we had a good time.
I know you did. I know you did, because the one thing I know about you is anytime you are around, there's going to be a party. And the party is going to be one that's going to enlighten you and encourage you.
I appreciate that.
Especially as it relates to knowing your history.
Interesting. I appreciate that. It's fascinating that some of us, for example, we worked in the last 40 years together and did all kinds of great things that many out there, even some of these young men that you're looking at out here.
Who happen to be my grandsons.
Yeah, both of them, right?
Yes, exactly.
They happen not to know what your grandmother did and all this good stuff. I know you've heard a lot of it, but you should hear more of it. And she's one of those giants in the community, too. I'm glad she got you involved, but you'll hear more about that as we go along.
Well, thank you, sir. I'm, you're always least known, not necessarily least appreciated, but least known in your own personal environment. And that's why I really wanted to hear you say today, what is your passion for moving forward, as we recognize that these bodies aren't going to last us a whole lot longer. I mean, we hope they'll hold out for a while, But what is it that we want to leave of our spirit and our soul from the information that we've gathered thus far?
I think that is the heart of what it is. That's the heart. First, we want them to know that the way they're living today didn't come by accident. Okay. In San Diego, I had called San Diego the Mississippi of the West because when I came, it was worse than many towns in Mississippi. Mississippi had moved forward, as you probably know. What we want them to know first is that what they see today is, in fact, a new day. It's really a new day. San Diego today is as much different from what it was when I came as the whole country is in terms of electing a black president.
Okay.
It may be more radical than that. That is, electing the president that's black may be more radical than the changes that have come in San Diego. Let me give you a good example. If the president had been born in 1961 in San Diego, there were only about 2 hospitals that would have delivered him. That was the best thing we can say about 1961. He could not have eaten in a restaurant. His wife could not have gone to any department store and tried on any clothes because we had a sign, if you try it on, you walk on. That is, no black could walk in a department store here and try on clothes and keep them. He couldn't eat in a restaurant. He couldn't stay in a hotel. She couldn't be accepted in any of these activities that normally people would be. The hotels, for example, were awful, to say the least. The department stores, it was 2 years later that we had the first black person in a department store. Her name was Barbara, in a department store. That was the famous Walker Scott store on Broadway there. He moved later on. She was the first one to integrate any of those department stores. And it was 2 years later that we had the first black woman teller in a bank. She's still alive, incidentally, the first woman. And from then on, we had the problem before us. These young men and women should know they have an obligation not just to take it for granted, that we had to live and sweat in this San Diego to change all of this that we'll talk about later on. So that's what we first want them to know.
Excellent. Excellent. That's a very important thing to know. They might not even know that their grandfather, James Cooper, was one of the first ones to write proposals so that jobs could be established, so that industry would take trainees into banks and manufacturing situations. And I know people who have retired from their banking positions after having risen in that arena as a result of those programs that were written and administered through Neighborhood House Association in the 70s. So this is recent, and you need to understand that. It's not far distant past history. You are living in times of history because the history has not been completed yet.
Not at all. In the social revolution in San Diego, let me give you some more good examples that you won't believe maybe, but I'll just choose some from my memory without trying to be...
Please, your memory's perfect.
In 1964, I came here to set up the Human Relations Agency. It was called the Citizens Interracial Committee. That's the CIC, we call it now. That was in 1964. But in 1963, what brought me here was 2 incidents that occurred in 1963 and 64. In 63, there were 3 young college students, as you probably know, that went to Mississippi. How many of you remember that? Went to Mississippi and they were murdered. Yeah. And the little town was celebrating the fact that these young college men that went there to help celebrate the civil rights movement were murdered, a celebration of the whites in that community. That didn't move San Diego enough to believe that San Diego was a racist city. That was 1963. In 1963, also early 1964, in 1963, CORE stood for the Congress of Racial Equality. They finally, in 1960, the young people decided, these old fogey people in San Diego don't think we have a problem. So they organized CORE, the group that started all the really marches in the South in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, they decided to organize CORE in San Diego. Well, to their surprise, they had to picket the school district, Bank of America, San Diego Gas and Electric, and a few other groups. Well,
AT&T,
the whole thing. Well, here's what was unbelievable. These young men, black, Hispanic, white, male and female, were bringing to the consciousness of San Diego's leading fathers, if you wish, that we had a problem here. And the city council of course, was in denial. So was the county, so was the school board for that matter, as you will hear later on. Well, to their surprise, one of those companies that we just mentioned, as they picketed that company in 1963, went to the bathroom. Their employees went to the bathroom, emptied their sewer cans in buckets, brought them to the windows, and dumped them down on the street on the heads of the core members. Got it? The city father says, oh, well, we don't really have a problem here. They went to court. They took these young core members to court, and they were tried, and they were sentenced up to altogether somewhere 1 whole year in prison. Not a single one of those employees that dumped this crap on theirs, not a single one was cited nor arrested. To the benefit of core members, there was a white attorney who was part of the intergroup of the black and Hispanic community. His name, he was a great guy.
Yes, he was.
He was a great guy.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Oh man, Porter was his name.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
John Porter.
Yeah, you know it. He says, wait a minute. These men and women were arrested, and none of those employees was arrested. He went to the court. He went to the judge. He says, Judge, look, you know, around the world, civil disobedience is not a crime like you meant that. So he says, look, these are young men. They work. They got families. Why are you sending them to jail like this? Why don't you make some arrangement? The judge had a conscience and sentenced them to serve their time in jail on the weekends. On the weekends. They had to report on Friday at 5 o'clock to the courts, stay in jail on the weekend, and then go home and dress on Sunday night and go to work. Now, in spite of all of that stuff, our city father says, there's no problem here. There's no problem. And then when one of the ladies that was assigned to Citizens Interracial Committee, which was a volunteer group, when she went to the mayor and says, we do have a problem. I know you assigned me to this group a year ago as a volunteer group, but we do have a problem. We need to do something about this. The mayor says, you think so? She says, yes, I think so. But they presented to the city council, and they said, no, we don't have a problem. We are not going to we're not going to form a human relations agency because that will imply we have a problem here.
So we don't want to admit we've got a problem, so we're not going to do anything about the problem that we're not going to admit.
That's it.
Okay, go ahead.
So what happened was, she says, but Mayor, the city assigned me to be the liaison from the city to this group a year ago when there were concerns about happening in the South. The mayor says, maybe we should have a Human Relations Commission. She wrote it up and helped the city manager to phrase it in a way, in a typical legalistic way, and presented it. And the city council says, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it.
They still refuse to do it.
Refused to do it. Mm-hmm. So the mayor says, okay. He went back to the lady, the liaison lady, to this volunteer group at this time. Her name was Mary Phelan. She was a young, white, good civil servant who understood what they were talking about. She felt what they were talking about. She was in tune with the country. She was the only one in the city structure that was assigned to the city manager.
How long did it take them to finally get this up and running?
3 months after, from June, July, August. When August came around, they had a meeting, and finally they said, well, we'll take your recommendation, Mr. Mayor. The recommendation was, since we will not create a new human relations agency, since this group has been volunteers have been working for the last year, and since we've already paid so much money to have this young lady be their liaison, why don't we designate them Citizens Interracial Committee, volunteers. Why don't we designate them as the official human relations agency of San Diego?
And is that when they hired you?
That's when they hired me.
And what were you able to accomplish for that agency?
Oh my God, everything. That's the way to phrase that question. I've given you some of the problems, some of the problems, but we were worse than that. When I called San Diego the Mississippi of the West, and I've given you some things, we couldn't eat in places, we couldn't sleep in places, we couldn't work in places. It was all white. No.
And there was redlining for the housing.
Oh, God.
You could not purchase housing in certain areas of the city. We do know that.
I'm glad you mentioned that. If I took my report card, Housing would be the first item I put on there.
Okay.
We could only live in a few areas, to say the least. We could live only in about 13 census tracts throughout the whole county, except for a few blacks who had been able to move in La Mesa and El Cajon, just a couple of them.
So most of that would have been in southeast San Diego, a little bit in La Mesa and El Cajon.
That's
There were a
right.
few families out in El Cajon.
yeah.
Not to mention the fact that Julian was first populated by African American people
me about
in the 1800s.
Right.
So San Diego had garrisoned itself around the military and was dependent upon the military. And because the military was segregated, San Diego was pretty much a segregated town.
Oh, to say the least it was, and I'm glad you mentioned Julian too, because later on, we won't do it tonight though, but later on you used to do a whole program on Julian.
Absolutely,
It's
absolutely. I want you to come back because
yeah.
we have many more programs that we can get out of you. But I really want you to talk about, to continue on this particular line of conversation so that these young people can see what has happened as a result of this Citizens Interracial Committee. What happened? What were you able to push through?
One, the housing. No city except El Cajon and La Mesa had a few blacks. We went to Poway, Fallbrook, Escondido, and the other places because they had those restrictive covenants you're talking about. It said in there, none of this property should ever be sold in perpetuity to any blacks, they call other names by then, of course, and Indians and Hispanics. We had to get those things changed in Poway. My staff, which grew up to be to 19, eventually 19 staff persons, and we had 29 ethnic groups, and we spoke 27 different languages altogether.
So altogether then, with all of this staff and all of this cultural richness, you were able to get rid of the restrictive covenants in housing?
In housing.
Okay, what about the schools?
The schools was worse. Schools, famous Carlin case it's called. That was the same as the 1954 school big thing that desegregated schools throughout the United States. Our city schools had never had a black principal or Hispanic principal.
So there were no black or Hispanic principals
Period.
at that time. We
At
do
that
know
time.
that has changed. Because of our time, I want you to just roll through this as your report card here, which is wonderful, as quickly as we can. Police, I know we just buried Johnny Williams this week, but he was one of the first black detectives that we had, and he didn't come into existence until the 60s, around in that time.
That's
Is that
right, and the only one at that time. The police was awful, to say the least. Police, we were the worst, have the worst police department in the world.
In terms of brutality, I remember the lumber yard.
Let me tell them, nobody wants to believe this. I know it for a fact. At the cemetery there, 40th and 41st and so forth, the police officers would take the young black men, not brown at this time, and put them in the back of the car and beat the hell out of them, literally beat them. And then they'd tell them, if you tell anybody, we're going to arrest you and take you to prison. So they scared them to death. But I don't have to guess it because I handled the cases. And finally we got the police to stop that stuff. Police was awful, to say the least.
It was well known that this was happening. This
We
is
call them
true.
the lumberjack kids.
Exactly.
And many of the black policemen didn't like it, but there was nobody to say anything about it. So our job was to change it, and we changed it. The TV and radio stations, it was awful. One radio station, well, no, I better start a different way. We are as invisible today as we were then, almost as invisible today. There are no black anchors. There were none then, as you probably know. No radio host, as you say. But the only one, his name was Gordon, that was at Channel 8 back then. He was a black anchor. After Gordon left, nobody would hire them. Channel 10 got on board in 1971 and 72, and I was the chair of the called MAC, that's Minority Advisory Council, with his name was Clayton Brace, who decided it's time that Channel 10 come into the 20th century.
Put a peg in that for just a moment, because the reason that you're able to view on internet and on this public access station what you're viewing today and the other television shows that have grown out of this particular show is because someone made the effort to stop what was happening. Wanda Ragsdale had a show before I did on public access. But I don't believe that there's been another African American that has been on television for a sustained period of time. This has been it until Walter Davis and the coalition has come into being. Now you're seeing more people, but this is 2010. We're talking about
1964.
So from 64 and 65 to now, the report card is still clicking.
Invisible.
The job is not yet done. There's more to be done. Okay, I want to direct you back here because our time is going.
That's good. We can take one more like that. Use an example, Poway. The students at Poway, whites, it was one black student there in 1968, 69, and 70. The students at Poway that I worked with had decided they would want me to be commencement speaker in 1969, 1970. So they chose me and told the superintendent in the schools. Well, the superintendent says, no, we're not going to have him. We're not going to have him to speak out here. He's radical, he's black, we're not going to have him. The student says, yes, we are. If you don't have him in the auditorium as usual, we're going to have it on the scene. If you don't have it out there, we're going to have it in the streets. If it rains, we'll have it in the gymnasium. Says, no, I'm going to do it. The student says, okay. I had to go to Washington, D.C., to New York. I left with my staff. If they change their mind, give me a call. So on that weekend, big weekend, all the stations were waiting. Can Carol Wayman come to Poway High School and speak? The principal says, no, he's black and he's radical. The student says he is going to come, and they don't care what they have to do. So on Friday, all on the news, the students met the last time and says, what's the verdict? The parents were with the students. The principal at that time was with the students, but the superintendent, acting superintendent, was not. The student says, we're going to have him. They call me in New York and says, come anyway. If they don't let you by that time go into the auditorium, the regular one, we're going to have it on the outside. So they called me and I said, I'll be there. We had a special met me at the station here, the airport. They hauled me off to Poway because at that time they had changed. They talked to the mayor here, the superintendent of schools here, an ex-congressman here, and all of them said, you got the best speaker in the world. He's not radical. That's who you need out there. So they let me speak.
He was radical, all right. He was radical then, and he's radical now. And my hope is that he'll be radical for years and years and years to come, because this is the kind of spirit and heartfelt compassion. This is a man who is compassionate about America, not just African Americans, not just Latinos or Asians or whoever else has come to make up America. He's compassionate about America and about America being what America is supposed to be, and is willing to put his activity where his philosophy is. And he's still doing it, even to this very day, coming without a great deal of his voice, but enough of his voice to yet be heard. And I am so excited and happy to let you know that I appreciate you with all of my heart.
Well, I appreciate you appreciating me, and that you have me on your program and think this is great, even though I can't talk very much.
Well, you're talking enough for me. It's all right with me. And this is not the last time that you'll be on the show. We need to do a series. Actually, you need to have your own show, to be honest with you.
Well,
how about that, Walter? Don't you think he needs to have his own show?
I agree.
Indeed, without a doubt. So we're going to see about that, because you have so much information. You talk about what they need to know before we go. You need to be putting it on tape, and so it can run in perpetuity, because you have put your money where your mouth was.
Appreciate that very
and
much.
your heart where your intellect is. And that's tremendous. Did I tell you he's got not one but 2 PhDs? Excuse me. That's a lot. That's a lot.
Well, I'm glad you had me on. Oh, got 3 minutes only to go.
Yeah, well, tell him what you want him to know in 3 minutes.
You should know that your obligation, your duty, not choice, your duty is to pick up where we leave off and push it forward, so that 20 years from now you can say, this is my country and I'm proud of it. We're not there yet. We have a long way to go. But you young men and young women have all the opportunity in the world to change this stuff.
That's right.
Color has no meaning. It's irrelevant to everything. Abilities don't come in colors at all. They come with intellect and so forth. And people like Alyce, for example, here, pushing it, as we say, pushing it all the way. Your job is to carry it on. Don't stop until the job is done.
That's it.
All over the world, make race irrelevant. Put it on the front burner. Take to Arizona. I just wrote some article. I write an article each week for the newspaper, as you know. The last two deals with Arizona, as you probably know. We ought to picket Arizona. You guys should picket Arizona until they open up that stuff in Arizona. It's ridiculous what they're talking about. So my job is to say, take the job that we started and finish it 100 years from now, 200 years from now. Doesn't matter. Color has no meaning except in our heads. And we should stop carrying around these images of people in our heads as if they're the reality out there. They're all in our heads. And thank you for letting me say that.
Hey, you got my permission. And you have my permission. You have my permission to respond. You'll see a telephone number at the bottom of the screen. If there's anything that you agree with, respond to that. If there's anything you don't agree with, respond to that. But respond, because this is your legacy. Don't be fooled by the hype. This is what America is all about. And he comes from a family of brilliance. Did I tell you that Nina Simone was his sister? Oh, well, I didn't have to start off with that because he's brilliant in his own respect. She was brilliant in hers. But you see, we have genetic predisposition for genius. Don't forget that, because you've got your share of the genes too. God love you. God bless you. Really glad you could be with us tonight. So thrilled that Dr. Carol Wayman could be with us. And I hope that he will have a show of his own. And that when that happens, that maybe he'll let me come on.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. You will.
Thank you so much for being with us. Come back and be with us. And listen in for all the other shows that we have. I can't tell you all the times, but they're there. All you have to do is keep clicking through, and you'll find them. 5 o'clock on Sunday evening for Walter Davis's program, and 6 p.m. on Sunday evenings for mine. Many blessings to you. Have a great life. We love you.
We're doing